The Thanksgiving table glittered under candlelight, but beneath the laughter and perfectly curated warmth, something fragile trembled, something that neither Brooke nor Taylor could quite name. It had begun as an innocent encounter, a private moment between Ridge and Taylor on the terrace of the Cliff House a week earlier. The night air had carried the scent of pine and ocean salt, and grief had weighed heavy in their conversation. Grief for Luna's death, for the family's exhaustion, for years spent trying to heal from old wounds. Ridge had touched Taylor's hand as she wiped a tear, and before either of them understood what they were doing, the distance between them had vanished. The kiss was brief but real, too real to dismiss, too dangerous to confess. Ridge walked away haunted by it, convincing himself that silence was mercy. When he returned home to Brooke, he found her softness waiting, her concern untainted by suspicion. She had been planning Thanksgiving, determined to create one peaceful day for their fractured family. Ridge told himself he couldn't destroy that, not now. So when Brooke asked about his long talk with Taylor earlier in the week, he lied, gently, almost kindly. "We just talked about Steffi and the kids," he said, eyes steady but voice slightly off rhythm. Brooke accepted the answer, but deep down, something shifted. She had been here before. The slight pause before he spoke, the way his gaze drifted when her name wasn't the one he was thinking of. History, she realized, had a way of repeating itself when pride and denial ran the show. Thanksgiving came with its own brand of performance. At the Forster mansion, generations of love and betrayal gathered around the same table. Brooke watched Ridge and Taylor exchange polite smiles, and though the room was filled with noise, she could hear the silence between them clearer than anything else. Taylor laughed a little too brightly when Ridge complimented her cooking. Ridge avoided eye contact when Brooke reached for his hand. It was all perfectly ordinary, except it wasn't. Brooke's intuition, sharpened by decades of heartbreak, began whispering that something had happened. It was in the hesitation, the almost flinches, the too careful distance they maintained. But she stayed quiet. She smiled for Hope and Steffi, toasted to family unity, and tried to believe that silence could keep peace. She had promised herself that she would not return to the woman she once was, the one who fought Taylor for Ridge like he was a prize, not a man. She would not let old patterns consume her again. And yet, as she watched the flicker of candlelight across Ridge's face, she could feel the storm building behind her ribs. Taylor, meanwhile, was unraveling. Guilt had never sat well with her. She had convinced herself that the kiss had been a moment of weakness, a product of grief and nostalgia. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ridge's face in that moment, saw the way he had looked at her not as a relic of the past, but as something unfinished. She wanted to believe it meant nothing, but she also knew better. Ridge's ability to compartmentalize his emotions had always been both his gift and his curse. He could love two women and convince himself that both were safe from each other's pain. But Taylor knew that kind of lie always rotted from the inside. As December deepened, Brooke began to notice patterns. Ridge's meetings ran late, though the office closed hours earlier. Taylor stopped answering her texts as promptly. There were tiny inconsistencies. Ridge mentioning a phone call Taylor denied, a canceled appointment that reappeared on his calendar with her initials beside it. None of it was proof, but the accumulation of almost spilt a truth she didn't want to face. She remembered the years when she had been the other woman, the interloper in Ridge and Taylor's marriage. Now, somehow, the circle had turned, and she was the one standing in the position she once despised. Her internal battle became its own silent war. Every instinct pulled her to confront him, to tear open the wound before it festered. But another voice, older, quieter, urged restraint. "Don't destroy what peace you've built," it whispered. "Don't let history define you again." So she waited, and watching became her only weapon. She read the pauses in his words, the guilt that flickered and vanished when he looked at her, the softness in his tone when Taylor's name came up. It was like listening to a melody only she could hear, one that would eventually crescendo into heartbreak. Then came the moment that broke the illusion. It was innocent, even sweet. "Hayes," Steffi's son, had been filming a video project for school about family. The assignment was simple: capture moments that showed love, connection, togetherness. He carried the small camera everywhere that week, around the table, through the hallways, even into the garden. When Steffi later sat down to review the footage with him, she found something else entirely. On the screen, grainy and brief, was Ridge and Taylor on the terrace, hands intertwined, voices low. It wasn't the kiss itself, but it was the aftermath. Ridge's thumb brushing her cheek, her trembling smile, his whispered promise. "We don't tell Brooke."
Not now.
The clip ended there, abrupt but devastating. Steffi froze. The camera had captured not just a secret but a legacy of deceit that had already destroyed enough families. She sat in silence, heart pounding, knowing exactly what this meant. She faced a choice: bury the footage or confront the truth. When Brooke learned of it, because secrets in that family never stayed buried, her reaction wasn't fury at first. It was silence. The kind of silence that comes when betrayal is no longer shocking but merely exhausting. She stood in the living room of the mansion where every Forrester scandal had eventually come to light and watched Ridge fumble for explanations. He said it was a mistake, a moment of weakness, that he hadn't wanted to cause pain during the family's mourning. But Brooke couldn't hear him anymore. Every word sounded like déjà vu, every apology a repetition of decades-old scripts. "I thought we were past this," she said finally, her voice trembling but sharp. "I thought we'd learned." Ridge had no defense. He tried to touch her, but she stepped back. Behind her, the ghosts of every holiday past seemed to fill the room. The Christmas when he'd left her for Taylor, the New Year's Eve when she'd taken him back, the birthdays marked by reconciliation and relapse. The tragedy wasn't in the betrayal itself, but in the familiarity of it. Taylor arrived later that evening, drawn by guilt she could no longer carry alone. Her eyes were red, her hands shaking. "It wasn't meant to happen," she whispered, but even she couldn't believe it. She had spent her life preaching healing, balance, morality. Yet here she was again, undoing years of hard-won peace.
Brooke didn't yell.
She simply looked at her. Two women who had spent decades fighting for the same man, standing in the ruins of the same lie. But the collateral damage wasn't confined to them anymore. The children, Steffi, Hope, and now even the next generation had seen the consequences. The video had circulated quietly among the family before anyone could stop it. Hayes's innocent school project had become a mirror for all their failures. Hope tried to comfort her mother but found herself reliving her own history, how her father's infidelity had once torn their family apart, how she had promised herself she'd never be part of that cycle. Steffi, torn between loyalty to her mother and anger at her father, found herself questioning the moral compass she had built her adult life on. The younger Forresters, watching the chaos unfold, began to wonder if love in their family was cursed, if betrayal was something inherited, passed down like wealth and beauty. For Ridge, the fallout was swift and merciless. He found himself alienated from both women, the two anchors of his life now equally disgusted by his cowardice. For the first time, the great designer, the patriarch, the man who could charm the world, was left speechless. He had believed that hiding the truth would protect them all from pain. Instead, it had unleashed it like a flood. In trying to preserve the family's unity after Luna's death, he had reopened every old wound. As weeks passed, silence settled where affection once lived. Brooke threw herself into work, rebuilding her confidence through design and mentorship. Taylor retreated into solitude, questioning whether she had ever truly moved on from Ridge or merely disguised her dependence as forgiveness. Ridge tried to atone, but apologies had become currency too devalued to matter. Even their children avoided family dinners, each retreating into their own private doubts. The tragedy was not that they had kissed, it was that they had learned nothing. The same choices, the same rationalizations, the same fragile justifications had returned to haunt them like ghosts that refused to rest. Brooke stood one morning before the mirror, the California sun soft on her face, and realized something profound. Love in this family had always been a battlefield disguised as destiny. And maybe the real courage wasn't in forgiving Ridge or blaming Taylor, it was in walking away for good. Yet as winter gave way to spring, something unexpected happened. The younger generation began to talk. Hope and Steffi, long divided by their mother's history, met privately one afternoon. They agreed that the legacy of betrayal had to end with them. They promised not to repeat their parents' mistakes, to face truth even when it hurt, to value loyalty over pride. Their conversation, though quiet, carried the weight of redemption. By the time summer arrived, the scandal had faded into the background noise of Los Angeles gossip, but its impact lingered. Ridge lived alone, designing in silence, haunted by the laughter that used to fill his home. Brooke found peace in solitude, her strength now her own, not borrowed from love. Taylor returned to her work as a therapist, dedicating herself to helping others resist the very patterns that had destroyed her. And somewhere in the Forrester archives, a small camera still held that brief clip, a kiss born of weakness, a secret meant to protect, a truth that ultimately set them all free. It was a reminder carved in digital memory that even in a world built on beauty, the human heart remains messy, flawed, and endlessly capable of repeating the same mistakes until someone, finally, decides to break the cycle. The morning sun bled through the fog rolling over the Pacific cliffs, painting the ocean in fractured gold as Dylan stood on the porch of the Forrester Finnegan home. The rhythmic crash of waves below felt almost accusatory, a heartbeat she could no longer synchronize with. She had rehearsed this moment for days, the moment she would finally confess, strip herself bare of lies, and face the man whose daughter she had killed. But the truth had a way of hollowing out courage. Her hands trembled as she knocked, her reflection in the glass door ghost-like, almost mocking. Inside, the family laughter faded into silence. Finn opened the door, the warmth in his eyes dissolving when he saw her expression. Dylan had once been full of light, the kind of woman who brought calm into chaos. She taught art to children, including Hayes, and she loved her work because it let her believe in beauty's power to heal. But beauty had deserted her that night on the highway. Luna had stepped out of the darkness too suddenly, headlights slicing through rain and fear, and the world had changed forever in a scream of tires and shattered glass. For weeks Dylan convinced herself it was an accident, that she had tried to brake, that Luna's fate had been written long before her car appeared. But the nightmares wouldn't let her rest. So she confessed, first to Electra, then now to Finn. Her voice broke as she told the story, the words spilling out in waves, how she had been driving alone, distraught after an argument with her sister, how she hadn't seen Luna until it was too late. She explained how she stopped, how she ran to the body, how Luna's eyes were still open but unfocused, how the rain diluted the blood into something that looked mercifully unreal. She remembered dialing 911, then panicking when the operator asked her name. She fled. Every night since, she had been reliving that cowardice. Now, standing in front of Luna's father, she could barely breathe. Finn stood motionless. Steffi emerged behind him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face pale. It took a moment for her to process what she was hearing. For months they had believed Luna's death was the work of a fugitive, an anonymous criminal already wanted by the police. But now, the woman who had painted their son's birthday mural, who had laughed with their family at dinners, was telling them she was the one. Finn's medical mind tried to compartmentalize, to analyze, to understand, but the father in him wanted to scream. Instead, he asked one question: why now? Dylan's eyes filled with tears. Because the truth deserves air, she whispered. And because I can't keep pretending I'm not the monster in the story. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Steffi turned away, gripping the back of a chair, struggling between compassion and rage. She saw the anguish in Dylan's face, but all she could think about was Luna. The broken body, the unanswered questions, the emptiness left behind. Forgiveness was a word she believed in until it became personal. Finn finally spoke, his voice trembling not with anger but disbelief. The police said they had no idea who did it. Deputy Baker told us the case was open. Dylan nodded weakly.
They know, she said.
They've known for weeks. But I wasn't arrested because they said it was an accident that Luna was already being followed by someone else. They told me to stay quiet until they finished the investigation. But silence feels like rot, Finn. It eats you alive. Her honesty didn't erase the horror. For Finn, every detail resurrected the night he lost Luna. He had tried to move on, focusing on his patients, on Steffi, on their children. But hearing Dylan's confession reopened every wound. He wanted to hate her, but all he saw was a human being consumed by guilt. He recognized that look. He had seen it in trauma wards, in victims who survived at the expense of others. Yet this was different. This was personal. He had to decide whether to believe in mercy or justice. When Dylan left, the air in the house felt fractured. Steffi looked at her husband and saw a man on the edge of breaking. She feared what this truth would do to him. The guilt, the rage, the conflict between his oath as a doctor and his grief as a father. She also feared what it meant for Hayes. Could they allow his teacher to remain in his life? Could they risk her presence when every brushstroke, every smile, now felt tainted by death? Meanwhile, across the city, another story was quietly taking shape, one less tragic, but equally consequential. Bill Spencer stood at the window of his office, overlooking the Los Angeles skyline, the weight of both empire and emotion pressing against his chest. In his hand was a folder labeled Forrester PR Transition. The proposal inside wasn't just business, it was personal. Katie Logan had been the heart of Forrester's public relations for years, but after Ridge's recent decision to outsource her department, Bill saw an opportunity. When Katie arrived later that afternoon, she found him uncharacteristically subdued. He began by congratulating her on the way she'd handled the recent scandals, Luna's death, the fallout, the restructuring. But beneath the flattery was a deeper motive. Bill wanted her to leave Forrester and join Spencer Publications. He painted it as liberation, no more being overshadowed by the Forresters, no more answering to Ridge's whims or dealing with his daughter's temperaments. You'd have autonomy here, he told her, voice low and persuasive. You'd be my equal, not someone fighting to be heard in a room full of egos. Katie listened, her heart torn. Part of her was tempted, not just by the offer, but by Bill himself. He had always known how to read her, how to find the soft spots she tried to hide. But she also knew this wasn't just about business. Bill had never truly stopped loving her, and his proposal was laced with the unspoken promise of something more. Still, Katie had changed since their last chapter. She had built her life around independence, around being more than someone's partner or someone's mother. Leaving Forrester now would feel like surrendering that progress. The meeting was interrupted by a faint sound, a creak on the staircase outside Bill's office. Both turned toward the noise. Moments later, a familiar pair of voices whispered just out of sight. It was Will Spencer and Elector Forrester. They had come to deliver design mock-ups for a potential joint charity project, but had stumbled into something far more intriguing. Standing at the top of the stairs, they exchanged uneasy glances as they overheard fragments of conversation. Bill's voice, confident but intimate. Katie's, uncertain yet tinged with curiosity. For Will, it was the sound of old wounds reopening, the faint reminder that his parents' lives would always be intertwined in ways he couldn't control. For Electra, it was something else, the dread of watching her mentor's professional world begin to crumble under the weight of personal emotion. When Katie left that evening, she was quieter than usual. She didn't give Bill an answer, but he knew her mind was turning. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the part of her that longed for safety, for recognition, for something less volatile than Forrester. He also saw something he hadn't seen in years: exhaustion. Katie had carried too many battles alone. And in her silence, Bill sensed his advantage growing. That night, as rain began to fall over the city, Dylan sat alone in her apartment, the sound of thunder like a punishment. She had done what she thought was right, confessed, faced the truth, opened herself to whatever consequence would come. Yet instead of peace, she felt emptier than ever. Her phone buzzed with a message from Electra. "They know everything. Be careful." Dylan frowned, confusion blending with fear. What did Electra mean? She had already told Finn and Steffi. What else was there to know? But then she remembered the look in Finn's eyes, the mix of disbelief and something unspoken. The next morning, news broke that Deputy Baker had reopened the case. He released a statement claiming new evidence suggested Luna's death might not have been accidental after all. A witness had come forward, describing another vehicle at the scene, one that had disappeared moments before impact. The implication was clear. Dylan might not have been the only one involved. Maybe she had been manipulated. Maybe Luna's death had been orchestrated. Finn was furious. He couldn't bear the uncertainty, not after reliving the loss, not after hearing Dylan's confession. He went to see her again, demanding the truth. She swore she had been alone, that no one else had been there. But as Finn pressed her, details began to shift. The car behind her, the headlights in her mirror, the voice on the phone that had distracted her seconds before the crash. Finn realized then that someone had set her up, someone who wanted Luna dead but needed a scapegoat. At Forrester, Katie received a message from Ridge asking her to contain the renewed media frenzy. Her job, once again, was to protect the company's image, not the truth. But she couldn't shake Bill's offer, his words about freedom. Maybe he was right. Maybe loyalty was just another form of self-imprisonment. When Will found her staring out her office window later that day, she didn't notice him until he spoke. "Mom," he said softly, "if you go back to Dad's company, will it be because of him or because you're tired of pretending this one cares about you?" Katie looked at her son, realizing how perceptive he had become and how much he'd inherited from both parents, Bill's boldness, her empathy. She didn't have an answer. The world of the bold and the beautiful had always thrived on the intersection of love and ambition, guilt and redemption. But now, each of its players stood on a fault line. Dylan, seeking forgiveness, yet trapped in secrets deeper than her own crime. Finn, torn between vengeance and compassion. Steffi, desperate to protect her family from emotional collapse. Katie, caught between her integrity and the pull of the man who had once broken her heart. And Bill, always the strategist, watching from above, waiting for the moment to make his next move. As night descended once more, the ocean crashed against the cliffs below the Forrester home, relentless, unforgiving, eternal. Dylan's confession had opened a wound that could not easily heal, and Katie's decision would soon reshape the balance of power in Los Angeles. Somewhere, hidden in the shadows of luxury and regret, the truth about Luna's death waited to be fully uncovered. And when it surfaced, it would bind these lives together in ways none of them could yet imagine, through guilt, love, and the terrible price of secrets kept too long.